The mine squares, also called the trebuchet position, is another very important endgame lesson that has to be understood very well, or it will cost you a lot of points in chess. Many mistakes that happen in this type of position is that white is so eager to go and win black's pawn that he goes and attacks it on e6, and now here he's actually going to be losing this game because black will come to the square c5, and now white cannot defend his pawn. He cannot take black's pawn as black's king defends it, and he also cannot protect his own pawn as the pawn on the d6 square attacks that square. So all he has is to move aside while black will take the pawn and then simply maintain the opposition and slowly promote the pawn to a queen. If we go back from the beginning, this game is actually winning for white. But before I go over how to win this game, let me talk about what mine squares are. Mine squares are squares that you don't want to be the first to step on, or you'll be blown up by your opponent. In other words, you will fall into Zugzwang, which means whoever has the move will lose. For white, the mine squares are the squares e4, e6, c4, and c6. If you notice, the mine squares are all the squares that the pawn touches that are the same color as the pawn. Having the king on the right side, obviously the mine squares that we have to be careful are e4 and e6, as we're not going to reach the ones on c4 and c6. So those are the squares that we have to be careful not to be the first to step on. For black, the mine squares are the squares c5, c7, e5, and e7. As you can notice, also the same color that the pawn is on. So the way you win this game, you want to go after black's pawn, but you gotta be careful not to step on your landmine. Therefore, we're going to move our king to f6 instead of e6, which is a landmine. From here, black has a few options. If he goes after your pawn right away, let's say he steps on the square c5, well, he just stepped on his landmine, therefore we will be able to blow him up. We're going to come to the square e6, and now he's not going to be able to defend his pawn. He's going to come to b6, and we're going to take the pawn and win the game. All he's got is to retreat, and after we cover the square e7, there's nothing that he can do to stop the pawn from becoming a queen. Let's say that black knows also that his square c5 is a landmine, but he still wants to go after white's pawn. Well, if he steps to the square b5, white will still be able to win, as he's going to attack the pawn first. The squares that you want to attack black's pawn are the squares c7 and e7, and black wants to attack white's pawn on the squares c4 and e4. But the rule is this: whoever is able to access those squares first will be able to capture the pawn. So here, since white reached the square e7 first and black will then attack the pawn, it's too late. White will simply take the pawn, and now black cannot take the other pawn as white protects it. From here, black just moves aside, and then white promotes the pawn. And if black is trying to defend the pawn, instead of attacking on a c4, he comes and defends it on c5. Well, what square did he step on? He stepped on his landmine. Therefore, we will be able to blow him up. We're going to come to the square e6, and now he's going to have to retreat. And after we win the pawn, he's not going to be able to stop us from getting a queen. The last thing that black can try after we move our king to f6 is trying to protect the pawn and taking the opposition from white. For example, here black could move the king to b7, and then when white attacks the pawn on e7, black will then come take the opposition, protecting the pawn. Well, even though black protected the pawn, again he stepped on his landmine first. So what are we going to be able to do? We're going to blow him up. We're going to move to the square e6, and now again he cannot hold on to this pawn. He's going to be forced to move back. And even if he comes to the c8 and after white takes the pawn, black takes the opposition, I do want to remind you that if our pawn is in black's side of the board, the critical square is just one square ahead of the pawn, which here is c6, d6, and e6, and gaining access to this square, we will still be able to win the game. After we move on the side, let's say king to c6, then black takes the opposition. We will simply be able to push the pawn. After the king moves to d8, we push the pawn again, and now black cannot maintain the opposition. He's going to have to move away, and we will be able to bring our king up and then promote to a queen and win the game. This next position, it's the exact same position that we saw previous. However, we moved everything one rank down. Here, also white to move. White will be able to win black's pawn again. However, this position will be drawn. The reason why, I want you to recall from the opposition video, our pawn is in our side of the board. And when our pawn is in our side of the board, the critical squares become 2 files ahead of the pawn. In other words, here the critical squares will be c6, d6, and e6. And after we will capture black's pawn, black will take the opposition, not allowing us to access those squares. So what's going to happen, we're going to move our king to f5, and black can retreat. We're going to attack the pawn. Black will defend it. However, he stepped on his landmine, therefore we're going to be able to blow him up. We're going to move to e5, and now black will move to square c7. I do want to mention that if black would move to the square d7, as we will take black's pawn with the opposition, we would be able to win. However, if black moves the king back to c7, and after we take the pawn, he takes the opposition, we will not be able to reach the critical squares, which are now 2 ranks ahead, which are c6, d6, and e6. And black, maintaining the opposition here, will be able to get a draw. I also want to mention that it's very important to note that pawns that are blocked also have critical squares. Whoever steps on the critical square first will be able to capture the enemy pawn. For white, the critical squares are 3 squares to the right and 3 squares to the left. In other words, the critical squares for white will be the squares e4, f4, and g4, also c4, b4, and a4. For black, the critical squares will be the squares e5, f5, and g5, also on the other side, c5, b5, and a5. Here, if we look at this position, white will be able to reach a critical square in 1, 2, 3 moves, and black, it's going to be able to reach a critical square also in 1, 2, 3 moves. If it's white to move, that means that white will be able to reach a critical square before black, therefore he should be able to win black's pawn. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily that he's going to win the game. Again, the pawn is in our side of the board, therefore we will need to be able to reach a critical square c6, d6, and e6. However, if black will take the opposition when we capture his pawn, he will be able to get a draw here. So let's go through the position and let's take a look at both scenarios, if black is going to try to defend his pawn or if he's going to go after white's pawn. So let's say here white will move the king to g2, then black will come to b7, king f3, and now let's say first that black is trying to go after white's pawn as well. Let's say king to b6. Well, here we're going to play king to f4, king to b5, king to f5, king to b4. And now we're going to attack black's pawn on e6 first, therefore we will be able to win it. And if black is defending the pawn on c4, he stepped on his landmine, therefore we will be able to blow him up. We're going to come to e5, he's going to move away, and we're going to take his pawn. If we go back from the beginning, if instead black is going to try to stop white from taking his pawn, let's say after moving the king to f3, black is going to come with the king to c7, king to f4, king to d7. Black will not be able to be successful in defending this pawn. Let's say he moves the king to d6, white will be able to take the opposition, and coming to e6, black will have to defend on c6, stepping on his landmine. Then we will be able to take the opposition on e6, and now he's not going to be able to protect his pawn. He's going to have to move back, and then we will take the pawn. However, he will be able to take the opposition and get a draw in this case. In this next position, it's white to move, and on the first glance it looks like white is closer to the black's pawn and he should go after the pawn. However, if you understand the critical squares when the pawns are blocked, you will notice that black is already on a critical square. Therefore, it would be a mistake to go after black's pawn, as white will lose the game here. Let's take a look. If white moves the king, let's say to f5, black will come to b5. If white will attack the pawn on e6, he will step on his landmine, therefore he's going to be blown up by black, moving to c5, and now he will lose the pawn and also lose the game, as after the retreat black is able to reach the critical square 2 ranks in front of the pawn. And if white is not going to step on his landmine, let's say he's moving the king to f6, black will be able to attack the pawn first from behind, and white will not be able to protect it, because after he protects it on e6, he's stepping on his landmine, black will blow him up again, and black will be able to win the pawn. Therefore, coming back from the beginning, here white should know that he's going to lose this pawn. Therefore, he just wants to make sure that when black is going to take his pawn, he's going to be able to take the opposition. So what white should do here is simply move the king back to, let's say, king to e3. Black will come to e5. White can protect his pawn on e4, king to c4, and now white will allow black to take his pawn, but he's going to be able to take the opposition after he does that, and therefore achieve a draw. This next position is white to move, and let's use it as an exercise. I want you to pause the video and try to think who's going to be able to reach the critical square and who's going to win the pawn here, and therefore win the game. Okay, assuming that you've calculated this position, here actually white will win this game. Even though it looks like his king is so far away, if we look at the critical square, he's going to be able to reach a critical square in 1, 2, 3 moves. And for black, any critical square on the side, it's going to take him 1, 2, 3 moves as well. However, white having the move, he's going to get there first. So white will win this game. He's going to come with the king to g3, black will come to b7, king f4, let's say king c7, king to e5, and here black, let's say, moves to d7, white will take the opposition, king to c7, and now white will outflank black, coming to e6, king to c8, king to d6, king b7, king to d7, king to a7, king c7, and now white will be able to win the pawn. And after black takes the opposition, if you remember with the knight pawn, if black has the opposition, we want to run to the rook file to be able to win here. And after black moves the king to a8, we're going to simply push the pawn to b6, king to b8, pawn to b7, king has to get out, we're going to move our king to a7, and after that we're going to promote our pawn to a queen. And coming back, if here black moves the king to a8, and then move the king to b8, allowing white to take the opposition when he takes the pawn. Here, after king to a8, white doesn't want to keep the opposition on the rook file, because after king to b8, if he pushes the pawn, this will end up in stalemate. But instead, after king to a8, white has to move the king to c7 to win this game, and now black only has king to a7, and with b6 check, after king to a8, b7 check, and king to a7, white will be able to promote the pawn and win on the next move.